to a little bonus episode of The Sacred. We don't have an interview for you this week, but I wanted to share with you some audio from a panel event I did recently. Those of you who've been listening for a while may remember an interview I did with someone called Rod Dreher. Rod is a writer and, mainly he's a writer and a journalist. And he has been the author of books like The Benedict Option and Live Not by Lies, and more recently has been writing about enchantment. Rod is a Christian. He was raised kind of lightly Methodist and then converted to Catholicism, and now he is an Eastern Orthodox Christian. He's a conservative. And at the end of the interview that I did with Rod, I reflected on how much we had in common, and we do have a lot in common, and also how different our conclusions were about some issues, in particular about how we think and speak about immigrants. And I asked him one question in that interview, but didn't really pursue it because The Sacred is not really a place for direct challenge. It's really about trying to understand. But I said in my reflection afterwards that I wish I had created a little bit more space to sort of stay in the tension of the difference around that, and I hoped we'd be able to have another conversation in the future. And we did. We were both at an event called Midwestuary in Chicago recently, and what you're about to hear is the conversation that we were able to have about our very different conclusions around particularly kind of posture and tone and how we speak and think about people who have moved country. There are some reflections from me at the end, but I really hope you enjoy listening to it.
All right, I'm going to step in a little bit. I'm going to do this. I feel like I was really excited to get Elizabeth and Rod some more time together, because I feel like you guys are a fun, spicy combination that has...
Don't go ick.
I'm not going to use the erotic
I'm no
word
William
or
Alot.
anything. I'm just saying,
that.
I feel like, Rod, that story that you shared of the sword and the stone, about leaving yourself open to the stranger and leaving yourself open to what the Holy Spirit might be doing in strangers and other people around you, and not closing yourself off to that. I feel like one question that I think is really sort of in the air is, how should Europe and Western European countries, and America too, be interacting with the stranger, with immigrants, and with people? How do we see them as people, but how do we also think about the coherence of a country? And so I'm turning up the spiciness, because one of the things that estuary is for touchy-feely, vulnerable crying sometimes, which is great, and I hope that you've been in a group that's been able to do it. But another goal of estuary is to be the place where hard things can be discussed, but it's a conversation. And so I'm gonna tack away from touchy-feely towards a little bit of spice, if we don't mind.
Well, and we're both living through this. She in the UK, me in Hungary, which both have very, very different approaches to migration.
Yeah, and Kale, you also can belong in this too. But all of the migrant crises of Rhode Island. So
get in here.
So this is my question: how should we properly interact with the cultural stranger, and what obligation do we have to them, and how do we think about this?
Do you want to go?
No.
All right, I'll go first.
I will, but you go.
One of the things that has really struck me, I've been living on the European continent the last 4 years, but my headspace, I live in America to a great extent by reading American media, interacting with Americans on social media, and it has just really startled me the extent to which Americans just don't know what's happening in Europe. It's not your fault. It's not our fault. It's just not reported in the media. And there is a massive and mounting crisis of the state all over in the UK and in Western Europe. It's it's a polyvalent crisis, but migration, the mass migration, uncontrolled migration, that's the neuralgic point of it. And J.D. Vance and Pope Francis got into a public spat about this sort of thing. Pope Francis, as you might recall, criticized the Trump administration's take on migration, said we as Christians have to be open to the stranger. J.D. pushed back by talking about the ordo amoris, the order of our loves. And he said, he's drawing on St. Augustine, said that we have a greater, well, of course we have to love the stranger, but we have a greater duty to love those closest to us. And the way I see the migration crisis in Europe is a lot of people in government, in media, and yes, in the church, have valorized the migrants as the other that allows us to offload our self-hatred, our anxiety, et cetera, et cetera. So the more of the other that we bring in, the better we feel about ourselves. And it's very much a class thing, I think, because the people who pay the greatest price for mass migration are usually the working class, the poor, and others who get pushed aside, as in the UK for housing. And I mean, we can talk about particulars about migration, but the thing that strikes me is that these migrants are coming in mostly from the Islamic world, but not wholly. And when I see church leaders like Pope Francis saying, throw the doors open wide, I see what's happening there, and they are radically undermining the possibility of any kind of Christian civilization, because Christianity is flat on its back, but in the Muslim migrants, whatever else you might say about them, they know who they are religiously, and they are not intending, by and large, not all, but by and large, they're not planning to integrate into a Christian or a post-Christian society. And so I think this is really problematic, and it's impossible to talk about because anyone who objects to it gets tagged by the media and the elites as racist, as xenophobic, as all the bad things. Meanwhile, the legitimacy of the state, especially in Britain right now, is being radically undermined by the elites, both the Tories and Labour and media and academia, by their demonizing any negative discussion of this. Meanwhile, the boats keep coming, and the government, neither the government nor the churches, et cetera, cultural institutions, will defend the borders, not just the literal borders, but the borders between civilizations. And if you're not willing to defend your own people and their right to live in peace and all of these things, even as you figure out what is our obligation to the migrants, they're going to lose everything. And I think that's what's happening now, that Europe and England and the UK are being swamped by sentimental humanitarianism, and those paying the greatest price for it are the working class, the rural people, and the poor. I take it you don't agree.
Not with all of it, no. Thanks, Sam.
I hope that, no. I don't know what kind of thanks that was, but...
No, I mean it. I mean it. So I want to do something that is probably not a super estuary thing, and I really want to say, for people in the room who are not Christians, is it okay if I just stop and pray? Not as a way of trying to impose what I believe on you, but because it's my best bet for how we're actually going to get to have something that's a conversation worth having, because I don't believe that debate is that useful. I really want to understand how we can be so similar on so many things and so different on this. So I'm just going to stop. Holy Spirit, who while we were yet far off and your enemies came towards us, would you give us wisdom and courage and commitment to each other's dignity as we try and talk about something that tends to raise the tension level in the room and put us into Lewis's first impulse to maintain and aggrandize ourselves. And I pray I wouldn't do that as I try and speak honestly in this space. In Jesus' name. So Sam and I were talking about this in the car because I find you one of the most confusing thinkers in the world.
I'm with you.
Yeah, me too. You are such an amazing writer. You're clearly lovely. And my book came out last year, I read your book and I was like, this is weird. It's like 50% of the footnotes are the same. Our influence are so the same. That W.H. Auden quote is my Twitter bio, my Instagram bio. If I had another tattoo after a terrible experiment in my teens, it would be that we must love our crooked neighbor with all our crooked heart, right? You understand agape, you understand self-sacrificial love. I think you understand the gospel. And yet, the thing I see, and this is probably where I start sounding super evangelical, and that might be one of the differences. The Bible seems to me to be fairly clear on, so I was reading this morning in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, like it's there in the law, it's there in the Hebrew Bible. You shall not have a different law between the native and the migrant. You shall love the native and the migrant the same, because you were strangers. You shall love the stranger because you, the nation of Israel, were strangers. You know what it's like to flee for your life. You know what it's like to flee from slavery. And this is annoying me, and I'm not going to apologize for getting emotional, because this is right hemispheric, intuitive ways of knowing that are important too. I believe our bodies are important, but it can sound like sentimental humanitarianism. But what I see is a Jesus who goes towards the most vulnerable and says, the Lord will put the nations in front of you. That's how the sheep and the goats starts. I've only just noticed it. They put the nations in front of you, and then he will separate the nations. The Greek's complicated here. But you can either say, put the people in front of you, or separate the people as in individuals. We don't believe in those. Put the nations in front of you, and then separate the nations and say, I was hungry and you fed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was a prisoner and you visited me. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And I think you can get all kinds of political theology from the Bible. It's polyphonic, it's complicated. I don't have a really clear idea about migration policy, right? I'm not saying open the borders, let everyone in. I'm saying for the people who are currently in my sense, in the UK, the Iranian and the Chinese and the Syrian refugees in my church who can't walk down the street without racist abuse or being called a paedophile, for the asylum seekers who are living on £12 a day committing suicide because they can't feed their children, the way we talk about them, the tone and the posture that we have to the aliens and strangers in our midst, even as we try and work out these hard technical things, it grieves me, and I want to be committed to the full dignity and humanity of every human being, and I see in my tradition a widening, an opening to every tribe and tongue and nation on earth. And so my desire to say, native, migrant, in, out, where you were born, is like the key criteria for what happens in your life. I worry about the way we're talking at the moment, even as we disagree around this, and that's all I have to say about that.
Well, I appreciate your vulnerability, because these things are really hard. They are. But when I was listening to you talk about the stranger and the neighbor, I thought about the thousands of young English working class girls in Rotherham in northern England who are pressed into rape gangs, and who, when their parents and others tried to go to the authorities, they were raped by Muslim Pakistani men systematically and put into basically sexual slavery and drug addiction, alcohol addiction. And when some of the people who advocated for them went to the authorities to say, you've got to help these girls, some of the policemen wrote them off as slags, as sluts, as whores, working class English whores. You don't see some of the people who advocate within the church for migrants. Like, where was your compassion for these girls? And I'm not saying it has to be an either-or thing, but I'm saying that this is the inability to talk about this, because this whole story, as you well know, was more or less suppressed for a long time because it implicated so many people in the English establishment in both parties. And I think one reason that the discussion of this, and I deplore with you the the demonization of everyone with brown skin, because there are people who are genuine asylum seekers. That's not what we're seeing getting off the boats and crossing the English Channel. We're seeing young men who are seeking economic opportunity or whatever, and I don't think they have a right to be there. And I don't think it's wrong for English people, I don't think it makes them a bad Christian, English people or French people or whoever, to say, no, you can't come in. You're not truly an asylum seeker. And I think also, you and I talked about this in the green room. I have a friend in Budapest, a Catholic woman. She's short and thin and fragile. And she moved to Budapest 2 years ago from Paris. Hungary famously has strict migration policy. They don't have a lot of it. And part of that is because there are so few Hungarians in the world. There are 10 million people in that country. And if they lose their country, there's nowhere else. And this is why they're so tough. And they can also see how in Western Europe, cities that have lots of migrants also have a lot of criminality. They don't want that there. Well, my friend moved from Paris to Budapest 2 years ago. And I asked her, so why are you here? Yeah, we all love Budapest, but you're from Paris, and Paris is Paris. And she said, Rod, you can't imagine how much freedom I have being able to walk through this city any time of the day and even at night and not be sexually harassed by a migrant. And she's really a deeply religious Catholic, but she was just so terrified, and she told me stories about just daily life in Paris, how frightened she was all the time. And she feels in Hungary that she lives in a country where the government will defend the rights of people like her to walk on the street in safety. And I think that whenever we figure out migrant policy, government policy, I would like to see a government place more emphasis on protecting people like this vulnerable woman than on protecting young men of military age who are coming across the Mediterranean or the Channel in boats and demanding services and so forth.
So this feels like it gets into a really left hemispheric way of seeing the world to me. And I do it too. Like, I go between a lot of tribes, and there's all this demonization of young men, and it's just different young men, right? My progressive tribes are like, well, of course, the problem is young white men and toxic masculinity, and, you know, there are some huge challenges for young men, and not all of them are dealing with them well. I'm not saying there's nothing there, but the lumping together of young white men as like a problem group happens in some tribes. And then in other tribes, it's the young brown men, right, who are all coming because they just want to make money, and probably they're sexual predators. And each individual particular human person in those groups gets elided. And I want us to be able to do the both and. I think part of the problem here is that we have such different news sources, right? Like we have been deliberately atomized on the internet. So the stories that I'm getting about, you know, migration data or what's actually happening or instances of sexual assault compared to kind of Twitter stuff about sexual assault will be really different from you. And we have no way of knowing, right? Probably the truth is somewhere in between. Probably there are like, so there's that. There's the we see different worlds and we're fed different stories, and I'm trying so hard to be aware of that in myself. Like, how do I go looking for the opposite perspective? It's one of the reasons I'm here, right? It's one of the reasons I read you. Like, how do I slightly challenge the bit of me that's like, I want to be continually reinforced in the story that I want to be true, right? Like, there are sexual assaults by young male migrants. I think that's true. I think they're small, and I think there are many, many people who are fleeing, sometimes war, sometimes just deep instability, sometimes authoritarian governments for a better life. And that's how America was founded, right? That doesn't seem to me to be like a morally reprehensible thing to do. I think I'd probably do it too. And so I don't know how we resist the impulse to go, all migrants saintly and wonderful, and we should protect them because they're all vulnerable. Or, well, of course, they're all slightly suspicious. And, of course, they're men, so they're all sexual predators. I don't know how to do this, but there's got to be a way of talking about it where it feels like a left-wing and a right-wing form of identity politics to me. And I I'm suspicious of that.
Kale, thoughts?
Oh, good. Oh, good. Choose.
You have the autonomy.
Pick one, Kale.
So, it strikes me that Christianity proposes or embodies a strange tension. And I think, Tom Holland gets into this with Dominion, that so you have notions of Christendom, and you have these notions of a kind of radical spirit of, that levels all things. And we see those visions throughout the scriptures of this sort of leveling. And one way to look at, sort of the history of Christendom is this attempt to balance these two seeming contradictions into some lived paradox. And, so you can kind of see the paradox right here. And engaging in the conversation with some kind of generosity to hear and to receive and to give is, I think, an important part. But I sometimes get the sense that we're arguing over a sandbox in which we are not entirely in control of. And so the frustration of the two positions are not so much with each other, but that those that have fabricated the social structure. And so when I hear Rod talk, he's giving voice to those who feel moved around on a chessboard, and somebody else, somebody, not necessarily an individual, but somebody has made a decision about winners and losers. And then I hear Elizabeth talk, and she's operating at such a local and personal level. Rod too, but yesterday we were talking a little bit about this topic, and you were living and worshiping with these young men who are not pedophiles.
Who are here because they got expelled for following Jesus.
Right.
And are brown-skinned and are in horrific circumstances in constant fear of being deported.
Right.
That's my homophily, right? I'm like, because they are also Christians, I feel a connection with these young men in a way that maybe I wouldn't if I hadn't encountered them in church, right? But it's made me understand how Muslim young men might also feel, right?
Right, and so
You're going to say I'm right.
guess this is the sidekick role, right? So you're talking, and worshiping with these young men who, again, the kind of generosity of spirit that you bring to the table as both a professing and practicing and trying Christian.
And failing.
Of course, all of us. But, that is part of your training. And so the reason why I wanted to sort of go up a level, that we feel on some level that we are stuck as mere playthings in a garden that is being tended by wolves.
Last summer I was in Budapest and met an American graduate student who had been living in Germany for a couple of years, in Frankfurt, I think it was. And a friend of a friend, and we just went out for wine, and he had been in the city for about a week, and he said, I really love it here. He said, it's so different than it is in Germany. I'm like, what do you mean? He said, well, there's so much street life here. People go out all the time. They're sitting in cafes. They this, they that. Like, you don't have that in Germany? He said, you'd be surprised by how much migrant crime and the overwhelming number of migrants has driven Germans to stay at home or go into private spaces, avoid public life because they don't want to risk the possibility of a violent encounter because everybody has a story. And I hadn't thought about the meaning of migration and in that sense, that it makes the natives believe that, or many of them believe, that it's too risky to go out in public and have what they had before, a public life, because these strangers we welcomed into our country are not being socialized and cannot be counted on to live in a civil way. And it's especially scary for women on the continent. And it's an anecdote, I know that, but it made me think about my French friend, the vulnerable French woman who moved to Budapest just because she wanted safety, which she had. We know people who come to Budapest from Western Europe. They've often heard, oh, Hungary's a fascist hellhole. They get here and like, this is not what I was told by the Guardian this country is. And after a couple of days, they're like, some of them have said, I've heard it with my own ears, this is what Europe was like 30 years ago, by which they mean it's safe and orderly before mass migration. And I think if one is going to argue in favor of mass migration, one has to account, one cannot just push aside people who miss what they had, who miss the orderly liberal societies that they had before a mass disordered migration. And I feel that there are some hardcore racists, skinhead types over there. I hate them. I do not want these people to flourish. But I think one reason they are beginning to flourish is because the powers that be in the media, elsewhere, the cultural gatekeepers have made an honest discussion of this particular very painful and difficult issue, have made an honest discussion impossible. I think David Frum, who is a liberal Republican commentator in Washington, he once wrote about migration situation in the U.S. He said, when the only people who criticize migration are called fascist, then you shouldn't be surprised when people start going over to the fascist side. Now, I don't think we yet have people actually going over to the fascist side, but I was telling Elizabeth, I was so shocked to go to an Ideas Festival in Hungary this summer and overhear a young Englishman say, I feel like fascism is the only thing that's going to solve what's wrong with the UK. I'm like, wait, what? I raised that issue with a mutual friend of Elizabeth's and mine, who's a conservative journalist in the UK. He said, you would be shocked by how often you hear that now. And he doesn't want fascism either, but this is being driven in part by deep, deep frustration over the seeming unwillingness of the government and the ruling class, by which I mean Labour, Tory, all of them, to get a hold of what's actually happening. Do you think that's fair, even that part?
Oh, absolutely. I have a lot of sympathy for people who are in rooted communities, who've had a thick local culture, who feel like there has been a thoughtless mismanagement of just plonking a high-need vulnerable population in their midst without the sufficient public services, without the schools, without the health service. I'd be flipping angry too. I just don't know if it's the fault of that particular group of people that have been plonked there. I think it's to Kale's thing. And when we're angry, I was reading Simone Weil this morning.
It's local.
Yeah, because we're interpersonal. But Simone Weil was talking about who the enemy actually is. And it is these bureaucratic, dehumanizing systems, not the other humans. And that... So this is I'm really aware I'm like, is this modernity coming out in me? But I used to be the director of a think tank. And I would be really interested in what are we actually, because you brought up sexual violence several times, it's not, I am a woman walking around London. My anecdotal response is if I have a man following me on a dark night, I feel scared no matter what color their skin is, right? I feel scared no matter what language they're speaking. I don't have a sense that women are more scared of brown men than white men. But I actually don't know in the data if there is what the correlation is. So you've provoked me now to go and do some research and not just go, I'm going to go to all the sources that I know I will agree with, but go, okay, what are we looking at here? Because these are narratives that we're telling, and people who are more, I don't know if I would even say I'm pro-migration. I don't know if I am. I'm pro-migrant because I'm pro-human, right? I don't have I want everyone to come in. I think it's entirely legitimate for a nation to carefully control its borders and manage its resources and think carefully about how people live together. I don't have a problem with that. I have a problem with the reaction against the mismanagement of it, blowing back on people who it's not their fault. They're just trying to live their lives, and now often they're just terrified.
But where would you draw the line then? I mean, I'm asking you as a fellow Christian, if the government brought you in, Elizabeth, help us.
No, please don't do that.
Yeah.
The government, that would be a bad idea.
No, I'm just saying, how do we decide, no, you have to go back? Because there have been cases in the UK of judges saying, like, I think it was a guy, an illegal migrant from Albania. The judges ruled the government can't deport them from the UK to Albania because the migrant's son doesn't like the chicken nuggets in Albania. This was an actual case in the UK. I mean, clearly that's bonkers. No, it really happened. I saw the court ruling.
That is one. I mean, if that's true, that's madness.
Okay, yeah, but that's what I'm saying, though. It's things like that that turn people against the whole thing. So where would you draw the line? Presumably you don't believe chicken nuggets are sufficient reason to
I don't know.
But how do we decide?
So this, I think, comes back to, again, like living in different worlds and hearing different stories. Because I worked in Westminster for a long time. I've got friends who work in the Home Office. I've got friends who work in the refugee and asylum sector. And the story they tell is that it's almost impossible to get leave to remain. That people fight for years, living in terrible conditions, and have their applications knocked back and knocked back and knocked back and knocked back. We have a person in our church who, this is the thing with China, I need to keep it very vague. A person in our church who has extremely good reason to claim asylum from China. Horrifying. Repeatedly rejected. And again, I don't know the data, and this is not normally where I go, let's go to the data.
But part of the incoherence, right, again, talking about that upper layer, is that you're talking about a person who's actually trying to go through the system, right? Again, and yet, and this is true, I think, in a lot of countries, that those who get treated the worst are those who kind of try to work through the system oftentimes, whereas those that just show up get fast-tracked in a sort of a strange sort of way.
Yeah, well, when I lived in Texas...
You have to show up in order to claim asylum. There's no... I don't really understand the distinction.
All right. I'll take my moderator's privilege to ask the first Q&A, and I'll keep it on this subject, and then probably for the Q&A we'll switch to whatever subjects bubble up from that. But I feel like, Kale, you mentioned earlier that one of the things that's happening is that men and women are finding it harder to get along. And that seems to be perhaps the most true in politics. Politics is polarizing. What's the easiest way to polarize a human population? Well, there just happens to be one trait that really divides groups 50-50. And I think that there's a temperamental thing. Like men, if someone is attacking your nation and you're a guy, you feel this thing in your gut, I'm going to round up my bros, we're going to grab some sharp things, and we're going to get rid of this threat. We're going to fight together, and if we need to die, we'll do that.
Like white blood cells.
Right. Like every guy has felt that.
I've got a pen down here. You can take it with you.
Right. And sometimes, honestly, as Christians, it can be hard to know what to do with that instinct. Like, I was 12 years old on September 11th when the planes hit the towers. But I felt that thing. All right, bros, what are we going to do about it? It's time. But then there's the other instinct, I feel like, that is more typical of the feminine temperament of, we need to take care of everybody, guys. Everyone needs food on their table. Everyone needs to belong. We need to, and though humanity can't exist without both of those things. And sometimes I feel like what's difficult as a Christian is that male instinct. You can see, you can read the book of Judges, and that's maybe a little bit of affirming of that. But,
it's not a manual.
But the New Testament is a little bit not as, when Peter jumps up with the sword and cuts off the guy's ear. Jesus doesn't say, "Good job, man. Let's round up the bros and the sharp things." He heals the man. He heals the man's ear, and then so there's the male-female dichotomy, and then there's the political-personal dichotomy. There's the what should the policies of our country be, and there's the how should I behave as an individual. And I feel like those things get very conflated, and that we take what we want to be true at the political level and embody it at the personal level to try and win more people to our political team so that what we want to happen at the political level happens by our personal influence. And that it can
and vice versa,
yeah.
I'd say.
All right, go for it. All right, question is, what do you think of that?
No, I would say that, you're right about that, but it works both ways. The idea of taking the personal and accelerating it or enlarging it to national or state policy, right? And it just can't work that way. I mean, the fact that, and this is why it's so difficult to do analysis by anecdote, the stories Elizabeth is telling about the migrants in her church are very real. I believe them. The story that my French friend was telling, and she'll get into really scary detail about the time she's been threatened sexually, are also very real. And both stories, true stories, relate directly to, so what should the people in charge of policy, how should these stories affect the way they think about things? And these are both cases where, if you reasoned only from the anecdote of the French woman or the anecdotes of Elizabeth, you would come to very different policies. So that can't be just that. But at the same time, I think what makes discussing these things so difficult is, and I blame the left mostly for this, it's because Elizabeth said in her talk yesterday that there's this deep impulse that in all of us to be right and good, and you react strongly against anything that threatens that. Well, I think this is one reason the discussion about not just migration, but about race and crime in the US and so forth, one reason why we have not been able to have honest, frank, forthright discussions about it is because the gatekeepers, anyone who challenges the official progressive narrative, is denounced not just as incorrect, but as evil. And there are real costs to be paid if you get on the wrong side of some of these issues. Costs to be paid in terms of your job, your public standing, maybe even get sent to jail in some countries. And so when the discourse, when the discussion only happens off stage, where you're only talking to people who agree with you, I'm talking about like a far-right person, everybody agrees with you, you don't have your priors examined, and you can't raise it in public to be challenged, because you could risk serious consequences, then this is, I think, what aids radicalization. And it's just crazy. I mean, David Brooks wrote about this in the New York Times yesterday about far-right radicalism, and he talks about this very issue, how he's been in spaces, he's a liberal, Republican, whatever, maybe he's a Democrat now, but he's been in elite public spaces, and he talks about how the progressives who controlled those spaces utterly demonize anyone who doesn't agree with them, especially men, white men. And they think that's normal. But David's point is that we, as David say, are radicalizing these guys because they just say, to hell with it. I don't care. If they hate me anyway, they think I'm a monster anyway, I might as well be a monster. That is a place we do not want to go, but that's where we are going. I'm routinely shocked. I'm an elderly guy. I'm 58. And, when I hear people I know like Kale and others who are dealing with young people, I wrote a piece for the Free Press about this recently, based on coming to the U.S. and talking to friends who teach in colleges and high schools about the shocking rise of open anti-Semitism among young white males. And it's just, they've been cut loose from any restraint. I think this is horrifying, and it's not going to end well for any of us. But how did we get there? And I think one way we got there is the sort of thing David Brooks was talking about, the demonization of anyone who goes against a certain narrative.
I completely agree. I think it's why these kind of spaces are so important, right? I feel really grateful to have been able to have a respectful conversation in embodied, where we're trying to listen to each other, right? And that was one of my greatest, I don't know where I sit on the map, post-liberal, blue, Labour, red, Tory, somewhere purple. And it was one of my greatest frustrations with the left is that purity instinct, that inability to listen to someone's reasoning or their story or where they've come from, but just going straight to name calling. And it drives mutual radicalization. And we're now in these death cycles of because we go straight to name calling, we can't really hear each other. And when we feel rejected, there's this deep instinct in us to harden in our positions, right? And you see it. It is a sociological phenomenon. And it is only when we stop and go, I wonder why they think that. I wonder how you got there. Please, could you help me understand how you got there? And I'm not going to call you names and I'm not going to finger point. I'm going to seek to understand. And then often the other person feels so acknowledged and seen that they go, okay, now would you help me understand how you got that? And it's not that you have to come to agreement, but it's the only way anyone learns anything, right? It's the Socratic thing. It's the dialogos thing. That is how we actually grow. But our defensiveness and our name calling, I feel like we both took a risk today. You've been taking a risk speaking honestly for a long time. Like, I really felt in my body this moment of, there's a high chance that a bunch of people in this room who thought they liked me.
See, I don't labor under that delusion.
Oh, she's a woke snowflake.
Well,
And I'm like, because we had yesterday, I was like, okay, I'm going to trust this group. I'm going to trust that even the people who deeply disagree with me. So thank you. I really appreciate it. Well, that was quite an intense experience for me. I don't know if you found it an intense experience listening. Yeah, even when I listened back to the recording, I could feel the little stress reaction. And that's really normal. When we try and actually address really deep differences like these, really ways that we really disagree, it's a completely normal, natural reaction of our bodies to get this threat reaction, this spike of fight or flight. And usually what it does just instinctively is it means that we run away from those conversations, or we have those conversations in ways that are very adversarial, either debate or like full-blown argument, insulting and name-calling each other. And I have come to believe that neither of those responses are particularly helpful or healthy or humanizing. And I won't kind of dig into all the evidence now, but I have concluded that those kind of adversarial debates are fairly useless for changing anyone's mind. They just make us feel good because we're trying to watch our guy win. And then actually a conversation where we can kind of come out of that threat reaction as far as possible and actually try and listen and understand and try and share our perspective in ways that is not designed to just make our side feel good or make us look good and clever, but actually is trying to communicate something in a way that someone who disagrees with us might be able to hear, that might actually take seriously their perspective and where they're coming from. That those kind of conversations are really rare and incredibly difficult. And it was quite difficult. I was really nervous in the lead up to this. I knew when I went to this conference that it's like a conversation between Rod and I, and bless Kale. He wasn't really part of this, even though he was on the panel, but he did sort of slightly deliberately absent himself from it, and I can understand why. That there might be an opportunity to have this kind of conversation, and nothing within me wanted to have it because it's really uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable talking about things that we really deeply disagree on, positions that other people hold, and I don't think it would be a surprise to Rod. Like, he says things that I find horrifying and makes arguments and statements that can make me feel very angry. So I don't want to downplay how deep these differences go. But I also was praying and thinking that it might be the kind of space where we could have a productive conversation around it. The estuary protocol, which you might have heard referred to and you may not have come across, is designed to be able to hold difficult conversations in ways that can be more productive. And so I felt like this could be the space where we could do that. And I think we had a reasonable go at it. Looking back, I realised I kind of unconsciously did a couple of things to help steady myself. The number of people who have commented who were there on the fact that I took my shoes off and crossed my legs. Lots of them thought I was wearing a dress. I wasn't wearing a dress. I was wearing a jumpsuit, for clarity. Otherwise, I wouldn't have crossed my legs quite so casually. Yeah, I took my shoes off and crossed my legs. And there was something about that, like putting my body in a physical posture, which usually signals being relaxed, that I think I was trying to steady myself. I was like, unclench your fists, stop reaching around, stop instinctively grasping around for weapons, like steady yourself. Everyone is actually safe in this moment. The stakes of this conversation are high. Some people, they are not safe, but you are safe. Like try and speak from knowing your current safety. And the other thing that I did is I prayed, which again was a slightly rogue maneuver because it wasn't an explicitly Christian conference. But it was almost me speaking to my future self. It was almost saying, this is who I want to be in this conversation. God, would you help me? It was reminding myself of my values and what I believe about the postures that help us in these moments. Because none of them come naturally and I needed some help. And felt like I'd received it, actually. So yeah, if you are interested in having these kind of hard conversations, probably not in front of 300 people. My calling is weird. But more than thinking about what can you do with your body to help you steady yourself, and how can you get the help that you need to stay in that more grounded place, in that commitment to see the other person as fully human, even when they might say things that you really disagree with. The other things that I think made it possible was that we had been in the same physical space for a day or more by this point, and we'd had some lovely chats, and like actual embodied contact with each other makes it much harder to stay full of rage and hate, because the whole complexity of people is more visible, right? Yes, they hold whatever other views that we might find difficult, but also we kind of see them eating lunch or chatting to people, or they need to go to the Louvre. Like the way we are all myriad and multiple, the way we are not just our politics or our religion or whatever it is, or our gender or our race. The complexity of the human is much more visible when we're in space with each other over time. So that helped, I think. And I'm still reflecting on how it went. I've had lots of feedback from people in the room that a couple of people said this felt like something sacred happened, something really meaningful happened. But a couple of people stood up and left. You can't see it on the camera. But as soon as the topic was raised, the tension in the room was there, but we were able to stay in it as created tension and tolerate the tension. So I hope you could hear some of what was going on in that space, and some of what both Rod and I were trying to model, that it is possible to listen to each other without demonizing each other. And it's possible to disagree incredibly deeply and not dehumanize each other, even when the stakes are this high. And I think both of us would say the stakes on an issue like this are high, right? Rod thinks that if we don't much more tightly manage migration and get on top of what he sees as a real kind of threat of sexual violence from migrants to young white girls, then the UK and the other countries facing this will descend into civil war. That's a real fear. It's a real fear. his and of many others. I hope that's a good faith representation of his position. And I think if we allow these narratives to escalate, if we go back to, this goes all the way back to Emmett Till. If we allow ourselves to go back to this like brown man equals sexual predator thing, we get to some very, very dark places that, I also think this could lead us into civil war, but I think in those kind of situations it will be the most vulnerable that suffer, because it always is. So we're not trying to have a nice public conversation because it's nice. The stakes of this are really, really high. And I believe with all of myself and all of my intellect that the only way that anyone complexifies or softens or resist the mutual radicalization that we're seeing around issues like this is in conversations like this. And I really wanted to go to the data. You can hear, and it's rare. And I think that was the bit of me that was like, it was the scared bit of me. Like, we know, and it's an old kind of, we saw it in the Remain campaign. If we can just get the data right, like I wanted to be able to say, this is the data that shows the instances of sexual violence amongst white men and brown men. I wanted to say, sexual violence is a problem. Let me tell you. Sexual violence is a problem. It is not, unfortunately, something that we can, hive off into one part of the population and deport them. It's a deeper problem than that. But I didn't have that data. And honestly, I'm not sure that it would have persuaded anyone, because we're in the place where someone would go, well, they would say that, or whoever did that data, or, we want to believe the research done by the people that we trust, and we trust different people. So maybe it wasn't a particularly bad thing that I didn't have that data in front of me. Yeah, lots more I could say. Many thoughts that I'm left with, but overall, glad we gave it a go. If I completely enraged you and you think you would like to shout at me about it, maybe don't. I don't think that's going to help. If you want to constructively disagree with me, please go ahead. If you want to constructively disagree with Rod, go ahead. Perhaps the most useful thing you can do, if you're up for it, is reflect on how you've come to your own conclusions on this, and then try and find someone that thinks something different from you, and talk to them about it, and really listen. See what happens. Thank you so much for sitting through this possibly slightly challenging bonus episode of The Sacred. My name is Elizabeth Oldfield. Our production team are Lizzie Harvey and Mari Ugandran, Lydia Taylor and Joe Downey. We're edited by Drew Hawley. Our music is by Luke Stanley. And the think tank Theos is who makes The Sacred podcast. We're part of Theos. We'd love to point you to the work of the wider team. And I will speak to you next time.